Sandiya To Hoshangabad. The Narmada was overflowing that season. It had rained heavily during the monsoon. People said that they had not had so much rain for a century. The monsoon had only just ended and the Narmada was still murky and muddy. The seasonal wooden bridge had not been built yet, not till the waters subsided. There was not even a stone to crack a coconut on. My companion Full Singh, a young Gond tribal, talks so little as if he does not know how to speak. We broke our coconut on a moored boat, offered it to the river, and set off from Sandiya saying, Narmade Har. It was 19th October 1983. We stayed that night in the temple at Macha. The temple was on the river bank, the village further away. In the evening, I was standing on a cliff, watching the Narmada flow past. Birds twittered in the trees nearby. The quiet evening slowly faded into night. It was delightful to be a part of the scene. Then the silence was shattered as dogs started barking furiously in the distance. We resumed our journey in the morning and soon came to the Kubja river. Ajera village, located at the confluence of the Kubja and the Narmada, is perched on a cliff like a castle in the air. It seemed so flimsy, as if the least puff of breath would topple the huts. Some down into the Kubja, some into the Narmada. We had to cross the Kubja, but it was so muddy that our feet stuck fast. In our haste to meet and mingle with the Narmada, she seemed to have forgotten her luggage here. A farmer ploughing nearby told us there was a ford upstream. During the monsoon, when the two rivers join forces and ripple over these fields, Ajera becomes an island sandwiched between two rivers. We made a long detour through the fields between the two rivers, forded the Kubja, and at last reached Ajera. That evening we staggered into Gajni, burdened with our luggage. As we came into the village, a local commented, "You have brought everything but the kitchen sink." Leaving all our encumbrances at a farmer's house, we went to the riverside and sat there, admiring the Narmada's elegance. Soon a boat came along and a gentleman alighted. We started chatting and he remarked, "My wife's family lives in Gajnai. If you wish, I could arrange for you to stay there." Together we walked back to the village through the fields. "How lovely the fields look," I exclaimed. "The fields look lovely because they are being ploughed and sown. The fields are waking from their slumber. Now the threshing grounds don't look beautiful. They seem to be asleep. When the harvest is reaped, the threshing grounds will have their own beauty. Then the fields will look awkward." So saying, he fluently recited a poem describing the seasons. "You seem to be an educated man," I commented. "I studied till the 4th standard. Do recite something else." "Lesson 1, Prayer to God," he said and recited the whole prayer. "Lesson 4, The Silly Boy," and he told the story of the silly boy. Lesson 44, Couplets from the Ramayana, and he recited couplets. He recited the story of a crackpot in the form of a long poem. Every time, first the number of the lesson, then the title of the lesson, then the whole lesson. He could perfectly recall lessons he had learned about 40 years ago. You remember even the lesson numbers? That description of the seasons I began with, that was lesson 64. Had he asked me to recite something, I would have had to confess that. In spite of living for 5 years in the ashram of a poet, I did not know even one poem. Fortunately, he didn't ask and I was spared the embarrassment. The way my mind works is, I read rapidly, on and on till the whole book is finished. But ultimately my mind is as blank as ever. But now I think, instead of devouring a book, chewing it reflectively might be a better idea. The house we had left our bags at turned out to be his in-laws' home. Both room and meal were provided. On we went in the morning. At Reva Bhankeri, seeing a boat on the Narmada, the habitually silent Full Singh burst out. Hey, that boat is veiled. A boat in Parda. The Gond youth had never seen a boat like that before. This veil is called a sail, I explained. It fills with wind and drives the boat along. No need to row. Our next stop was Iswarpur, surrounded on 3 sides by the Rhine River. We crossed the Rhine twice. The third time we had to cross it near the confluence. But the sight of the silt was very discouraging. When the Narmada is in full flood, the flow of a tributary tends to back up. The fine particles of clay in the muddy water settle on both sides of the current in a thick layer of silt. This often happens at confluences. Then there is no choice but to take a detour. We were joined by 3 pilgrims as we crossed the Denva. Old Dadu, 75, middle-aged Kaka, 55, and 28-year-old Ramu. Dadu and Kaka were cousins and Ramu was their nephew. They were village farmers. Their 7 heads showed that they had just set out on the parikrama. As they went along, their hair would grow long and would not be cut until the journey's end. One could guess the length of the distance covered by the length of their hair. There was bustle and bustle at the Narmada's edge. 3 elderly men were setting out on the pilgrimage from here. Their families had come to see them off. As we sat there, a lady said, "The meal is ready. Take your dip and come and eat." After the ceremonial meal, it was time for them to depart. All the relatives bade them a tearful farewell. One little girl clung, sobbing, to her grandfather. I noticed Ramu wiping his tears away. He was a brave fellow, tall and well-built, chatty, sociable, and good-natured. As we went on, he said, "I have 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. They have lost their mother. I left the children at my brother's home. On that day, the pang of separation was not so acute as it was today. I had hardened my feelings and left when they were asleep. Today, when I saw that girl clinging to her grandfather and crying, I thought of my own children. I could not hold back my tears. We did not know that the Maru river was muddy. Ramu was striding along ahead of us. After a few steps, he began sinking. He sank right up to his thighs. too terrified to utter a word. Fortunately, he sank no further. We encouraged him and he felt better as the sinking had stopped. First he pulled his stick out, then slowly one leg and then the other. I had a narrow escape, he said when he was on dry land again. I would have sunk deeper, but Mother Narmada saved me. Otherwise, the Maru wanted to eat me alive. We had no choice but to make a long detour to cross the Maru, so we went upwards. In wet places, the ground was as soft as butter underfoot, but in dry patches it was hard, cracked into pieces, prickly as thorns. I couldn't bear to see 75-year-old Dadu walking barefoot over this dry, crusted soil, but he didn't utter a single complaint. Then we met a local who told us that we would be able to cross easily at the confluence of the Narmada and the Maru. Impossible! If there was so much mud here, it would be even worse where the rivers meet. It would be futile to go there. We went round the long way and managed to cross the Maru and reach Satavasa. Our companions had acquaintances in this village, so we stayed with them. When they heard about our Maru misadventure, they laughed and told us that a crossing had indeed been made at the confluence only 2 days ago. Our long detour had been unnecessary. That evening, an enormous full moon rose over the Narmada. The earth was bathed in milk. Who would say that the sunlight of day and the moonlight of night have but a single source? The moon is probably the biggest catalytic agent in the universe. It does nothing and yet it does everything. We left at dawn, seeing the fertile earth of the riverbank. My farmer friend exclaimed, "This soil is gold, pure gold." There are many acacia trees in this area. Ramu and Kaka pulled thin twigs of the trees with a sharp jerk, picked off all the thorns, and we got ready-made toothbrushes. We reached Bakchera that evening and dumped our bags on a chabutra in the village. Our companions went off to beg for food, and I went in search of a place to stay. I met a teacher who had an empty cowshed, neat and clean. He offered it to us. He came over for a chat and remarked, "You are spending your time well, but you should definitely bring a tape recorder along too. Wherever you hear good folk music, you can record it at once." Just then an invitation came from the house, so we went there and were treated to tea and milk. Then he went on, "It's good that you are sketching, but you should take a camera as well. You might not find time to sketch everywhere." Each time he came from the house, he brought a new suggestion. The next time he came up with, "When you are on a parikrama, you should beg for food from at least 3 houses." Who would give alms to a pilgrim festooned with a camera and a tape recorder? His next suggestion, however, was brilliant. You should carry some nuts and raisins with you when on a pilgrimage. When you are very hungry and a meal will not be ready for a long time, eat a handful of nuts and raisins. This will give you instant energy. How wonderful it would be if people gave us nuts and raisins in alms. Then we could adopt 2 of his suggestions at once. It was so long since I had eaten nuts or raisins, though I could hardly remember which was which. We left the following morning. After Ganera, we had to leave the river bank. The Narmada had shifted course as if leaving an old home for a new one. Pilgrims do not cross the dry abundant bed, however, so we walked along it. It is called the Old or Aged Narmada. As the monsoon had only just ended, there was water here and there in the old riverbed. We arrived at Gauhat at midday. Thousands of parrots flew around the trees. There was a large crowd of pilgrims at the village pool, but most of them would hurry straight to Hoshangabad, a big detour from the Narmada's source. We continued beside the old Narmada. On our left, yellowish red and dark brown hills dipped and rose. The old riverbed of the Narmada was there on our right. We stayed the night in Bikor, then met the Narmada again at Aharkhera. Now our path wound roughly over hillocks and among bushes, so it was midday by the time we reached Surajkund. The river seemed to be living in seclusion here. Apart from a herd of cattle with tinkling bells and 2 or 3 herdsmen, there was nobody about. A gentle young sannyasi lived in a hut nearby. During the course of the conversation, he recounted, "This happened 6 or 7 years ago. One day a sannyasi came and took his seat under a tree. I was on my way back from bathing. I saw him, but as he said nothing, I kept silent. As night fell, I became worried and went to see. He was still sitting there as before. I respectfully brought him here. He stayed for 5 or 6 days. He was from Bengal and had a profound knowledge of the Vedas. I am a Vedantist too, and learned a lot from him. But if I had not gone to invite him, he would not have come by himself. He never asked anything from anybody, not even alms. We reached Goda that evening. The village had been flooded twice and now had moved far from the river, where only a few houses remained. We stayed the night in a hut built on the river bank. On waking in the morning, I saw the surface of the Narmada glittering in the first rays from the sun. As the sun rose in the sky, the width of its reflection stayed the same, but it lengthened into a gleaming column. The victory column of the sun. After that, every morning and evening, I made it a point to watch the freshly built victory columns of the sun and the moon. All the victory columns of the world will crumble to dust someday. Only these two will last forever. We travelled on. The millet in the fields had grown high enough to hide an elephant. After Chandla, we met the river Tawa and walked along the bank. We could see a temple close to the confluence of the Tawa and the Narmada. It had seemed close enough from the distance, but we were perspiring by the time we reached it. There were many rocks in the Narmada. We were hearing her sweet, fresh voice after many days. The hills rose majestically from the opposite bank, watching over the two rivers as they met and mingled. The Tawa is a very wide river, broader than the Narmada and in full flow. We crossed the Tawa with great difficulty, bathed in the confluence, and came to Bandravan. There was a road from here. Now Hoshangabad was not far off. The Tawa on our left, the Narmada on our right, one coming, one going, and the road in between. We reached Hoshangabad at dusk and went straight to the famous Setani Ghat. Many pilgrims were there already. Some settled for the night under the trees outside. We found a room in a dharamsala and cast anchor there for 2 nights.